Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of Pacific Forum and our event sponsor, the Hindu American Foundation, I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, A New Era of U.S.-India Relations, Part 1, Working Together. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum, and your moderator for today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Pacific Forum is a Honolulu-based foreign policy research institute. Through our original research initiatives, cross-cutting publications, public webinars, next-generation initiatives, and Track 2 policy dialogues, Pacific Forum seeks to promote a deeper understanding of the Indo-Pacific's geopolitical and security environment. And today's program is no exception. From the Quad to IPEF, the trajectory of the U.S.-India relationship clearly points upward. What forms of collaboration can we expect from the world's two largest democracies in the future? What can they do for each other that other countries cannot? And what are the best ways to sustain their cooperation? We'll be examining the answers to those questions and more in today's event. But before we jump to our discussion, allow me to share some housekeeping rules. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a audio recording of this session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. This session will include feedback and Q&A with the audience. Participants' cameras are disabled throughout the session. However, during our Q&A discussion, participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback. Note that participants may submit questions in the Q&A box as you have them during the presentations. With that, allow me to briefly introduce Pacific Forum Senior Fellow Akhil Ramesh to provide some opening remarks. Akhil?
Thank you so much, Rob, for the kind introduction. I just got to put it out there, of all the days they could have chosen for mowing the lawn, the management chose today. So if there are any disturbances in the background, it's because of that. My apologies in advance. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all who have joined here. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here for this exciting discussion on the new era of U.S.-India relations. First and foremost, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Hindu American Foundation for making this happen, and in particular Samir for supporting us on this endeavor. As one would say, ideas mean nothing unless there's funding to back it up. So HAF made that happen. We had this idea of US-India program, and HAF is making that happen. So thank you so much to HAF. And this could not have come at a better time. We started the Comparative Connections chapter in 2022. And 2022, as you might know, was basically a year of friendly fire, constant stress testing of the US-India relationship through Cold War era differences. So I should say I had this privilege to author the 3 chapters in 2022, giving me an opportunity to address complex historical topics, foreign policy concepts such as non-alignment, multi-alignment, and so on. That was actually the motivation behind the Comparative Connections chapters that I authored in 2022, to make it clear to an audience that it's not just foreign policy wonks, but also to broader, the public. It was kind of putting out fires by explaining these concepts, because I should say the timing made it bittersweet. I remember writing in a South China Morning Post article that if I had a penny every time an analyst or journalist questioned the bilateral relationship, I would be a millionaire by the end of the year. So it was a hard year, 2022, explaining Russia, India, US, Pakistan, China to an audience that wasn't aware of these intricate, complex relationships. But thanks to the leadership of both the US and India, I had a lot more to write about than just the Cold War era differences. I had the opportunity to write about the Indo-Pacific synergies, the Hawaii to Himalayas defense partnership, and place a rapidly expanding partnership in context. And just last month, with one of the panelists here, Michael Rubin, we started to unpack these synergies in a chapter. So I'm looking forward to this discussion with the same excitement and curiosity as all others who have joined us from around the world. Each of the panelists have broad experience, years of experience working with prestigious organizations. But one thing that makes this a stellar panel on US-India relations is the geographic expertise. We have Michael with strong India-West Asia expertise. We have Satu with India-Rest of Asia expertise, and Cleo with Pacific Islands and India expertise. If I had to pick a different title for the panel discussion, I would have called it Hawaii to Himalayas panel, because it truly spans the length and breadth of the Indo and the Pacific. So with that, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Akhil. And with that, we will move on to the presentations. First by Dr. Satu Limaye of the East-West Center, followed by Ms. Cleo Pascal of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Dr. Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute. Today's first speaker will be Dr. Satu Limaye. Satu is Vice President of the East-West Center and the Director of Research and East-West Center in Washington, where he created and now directs the Asia Matters for America initiative and is the founding editor of the Asia Pacific Bulletin. He is also a senior advisor at CNA Corp, Center for Naval Analyses. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and received his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a George C. Marshall Scholar. Dr. Limaye is also a regular contributor to Pacific Forum's Comparative Connections e-journal. A link to his latest chapter on India-East Asia relations is available in the chat box now. And with that, Satu, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, and greetings to everyone, my fellow panelists in particular, and of course our participants. It's always a great honor and delight to be invited by Pacific Forum to participate and interact with them. As some of you will know, I think my relationship goes back almost 25 years. I think I wrote my first piece on India and East Asia, if you can believe it, in 2001 for Comparative Connections. So it gives you a sense of a perspective that at least I come to the subject of India's role in the world, India-US relations, and India in East Asia. I couldn't think of a better time. I think Akhil referred to this about the timeliness of this program. I see that it's part one, so I'll have to tune in as well to part two. But the timeliness is amazing. As you all know, Prime Minister Modi has been invited for a state visit, only the third of the Biden administration's first term. And so it's a very interesting time to be looking at US-India. It's also a time when the India-PRC relationship is at an extraordinarily low point, and as is the US-China relationship, notwithstanding rumors over the last 24 hours, maybe confirmed by now, that Secretary Blinken plans to go to China in the coming weeks. And then, of course, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And the invasion, which has had kind of echoes of the Cold War that Akhil referred to, and exactly where India is on Russia and what that implications are for US-India relations. A fourth contextual point I want to make is India's increasingly prominent role on the world stage. Not only have they recently hosted the G20, but were recently present at the G7. Prime Minister Modi had a well-publicized visit with President Zelensky. And Prime Minister Modi has also been on a very active and energetic set of meetings bilaterally around the world, including a heavy focus on the global south. But, and I will end my context and then go to opportunities and constraints in the relationship. Having said all of this and the prominence of India, the activity of India, the particular key junctures where we find ourselves, it is also fair to say that we're contributing to Akhil Ramesh's retirement fund by putting a bit of money into the earnings about another debate about where we are on US-India, not least in the article by Dr. Ashley Tellis about in Foreign Affairs about exactly what we can and cannot expect of India. So the context is really, if you will, full and really very powerful to take an assessment. So what's mine? What's my assessment of opportunities and constraints? The first thing I would say is, to me, again, I repeat, following this relationship, I wrote my first book on US-India relations was, I believe, published in '92. So just to give you a sense of the context. I have always believed that the US-India relationship is one of accommodation and incrementalism rather than a profound strategic revolution. I know that that is not the current narrative, which is focused heavily on the idea or the concept. that India will be a strategic partner in a confrontation with China. And that is kind of the other end of the spectrum. It's been on the end of the spectrum. In fact, my first book on US-India was called The Pursuit of Accommodation, which was deliberately chosen in part because my first title was rejected, which we won't get into here. But The Pursuit of Accommodation is simply because I felt that the maximum you could achieve in US-India relations that many years ago was accommodation rather than a revolution in the relationship. And I continue to remark that we have had a steady upward trajectory, phenomenal and remarkable upward trajectory in US-India relations, but it's still a one of incrementalism and accommodation rather than revolution. So that's really my first point, is very practical. Second opportunity, I think, is that there has been, as I said, a steady upward trajectory, and it's really quite phenomenal if you look at the data on US-India defense cooperation, if you look at India-US security cooperation, military cooperation, trade and investment cooperation, people-to-people relations. Let's not forget this huge element of the relationship. Almost 3.5 million Indian Americans, hundreds of thousands of students, science and technology linkages, commercial relationships, scientific relationships. It's really quite phenomenal. And we're moving into new areas because some have been less or more successful. So the Defense Technology Industrial Initiative DTTI did not do so well. And we're moving towards this new CET, Critical Emerging Technologies era. So we'll simply have to see. It's so recent that we do not know what concrete, practical collaborations will come from that, but it shows you the continuing efforts to build on the science technology relationship, whether that apply to defense as well as civilian technology. The third point I'd like to make about the opportunities is that we're moving to an era which is much more in the international system fragmented. It is not a kind of system that will look to old or post-war solutions and multilateralisms. I call them in a speech at CSIS active multilateralism, or rather than passive multilateralism. And so you have before you things like the Quad and the AUKUS and the Mineral Security Initiative and a whole range of functional as well as partner-based coalitions to achieve specific ends. And I think this is a grand opportunity for the US-India relationship because these can be pursued without the overarching World War II era, post-World War II era configurations. So we don't necessarily have to get along in EAS, but we can certainly work together on a pragmatic public goods provision through the Quad. We can work on trilaterals of various kinds, whether they be in the Middle East or whether they be in East Asia. So I wanted to flag that opportunity. The fourth opportunity, similarly in this theme of a fragmented world, is that everyone has their own pitch, or whether it's a matter of degrees or pace of change. But I sense a certain level of deglobalization and a certain level of decoupling. I know that's not the right phrase. People call it de-risking. It's sort of you say potato, I say potato. But the simple fact is that high era of integration and international globalization seems to me now contested. And the reason that's relevant to US-India relations, in my estimation or assessment, is because India has been very wary of the large mechanisms for collaboration and cooperation in the international economic environment. So, for example, US and India have significant differences in the WTO. They've had, India is not a member of APEC. It is not a signatory, as we are not, the United States is not, of CPTPP. So the new environment of a fragmented coalitional economic arrangements, whether they be on minerals or supply chains or technology, allow India to be brought into particular configurations that get beyond traditional old disagreements and and constraints. So I see that as an opportunity. Let me turn to some constraints because I see that I have 3 minutes left. First, I think that there is a fundamental disconnect between the United States' view of interoperability, integration, and primacy requirements, and India's requirements for autonomy and multipolarity. The US is based on a system, US approach to defense and security affairs, of primacy, and less or more, one can argue. It's certainly contested. President Obama gave a famous speech about primacy, but certainly our current policy is primacy. It's built around docking on allies and integrating them and making them interoperable with American strategic and defense requirements. And I think India's approach is not that approach. It's neither right nor wrong, but it is a constraint that India wants to keep its autonomy, maintain its autonomy at a higher level than the US ideal ambitions would be, and that India wants a multipolar world. I do not see much change in that, notwithstanding the nuances of non-alignment versus strategic autonomy, multi-alignment, et cetera. The fundamental core issues are there. And by the way, I just want to be very clear. I don't think this is wildly unique in India. I assure you that even our allies wish to keep autonomy and a certain degree of flexibility, even if they're very close allies. The question is, most of those allies do so from within the alliance. India does so from outside an alliance. The second constraint is that I think it is mistaken to think that differences on China or Russia are the sole problem in US-India relations. They are not. I believe that India and China, Russia and China are not fundamental preventers of constraints to US-India relations, but they do cloud perceptions, pace, and the ability to move forward in highly sensitive and technical areas. So they're not in and of themselves constraints to doing anything with India, as the historical and empirical record shows. We've been able to do a tremendous amount with India, notwithstanding a Russia relationship, or the fact that until 2-3 years ago, when Chinese aggression in the Himalayas started, that India was very reticent of being particularly forward-leaning against China. So we've done a lot, but they will serve as a shadow over how far we can go. And then finally, I'll end with, there are domestic considerations of the trajectory in Indian politics that attract attention in this democratic society, that will implicate support on Capitol Hill, that will implicate the contours and parameters of the pace and depth to which India can go. So let me conclude there with both those opportunities and constraints. And once again, thank you for the invitation to participate today.
Thank you very much, Satu, for your always informed comments. Next, I am delighted to welcome Ms. Cleo Pascal. Cleo Pascal is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focusing on the Indo-Pacific region. She has testified before the U.S. Congress, regularly moderates and lectures for seminars for the U.S. military, and has taught at defense colleges in India, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Oman. She is the North America Special Correspondent for the Sunday Guardian, India. A link to her recent congressional testimony on preserving U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific can be found in the chat box now. And with that, Cleo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you to HAF and Pacific Forum for doing this. It's incredibly important and a very helpful discussion to have. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I do have a little presentation because it's worth sometimes taking a look at a map. So if we can get up the first map. I'll be talking about the Pacific Islands and the U.S.-India relationship there, because for me, this is the front line in this political warfare battle of systems. And by understanding what China is doing and what's happening to the people in the Pacific Islands, it gives perhaps a better idea of how the U.S. and India can collaborate in order to deliver real security, including human security across the region. So first, this first slide shows where the U.S. is in the Pacific. There's U.S. territories, pieces of U.S. soil with U.S. citizens all the way across the Pacific, including to Guam, the Marianas, American Samoa. So everything on this map, that is this dark blue color, is the United States of America. Next slide, please. These three lighter blue countries in the middle, Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia, are they're independent countries, but they have a compacts of free association with the United States. This is a unique relationship. These are the only three countries on the planet that have this relationship with the United States. Next slide, please. The nature of this relationship is fundamental to U.S. defense architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So as per these agreements, the government of the United States has the full authority and responsibility for the security and defense matters in or relating to the Marshall Islands, the Federated States, Micronesia, and Palau. Next slide, please. So those three blue countries in the middle is an extension of the U.S. defense perimeter. They make it possible for the U.S. to operate unimpeded in a military sense from Hawaii all the way to its treaty partners just right next door. And what augments this, next slide, please, is that two of those three recognize Taiwan. And just below, it's a little bit harder to see, Tuvalu and Nauru also recognize Taiwan, which gives a further layer of protection from Chinese influence operations. Next slide, please. Combine that with this lighter blue, which is the territories of the U.S. treaty allies. And you can see that from a strategic perspective, if you're just looking at what's on paper, the U.S. seems to have a free run through the Pacific Islands all the way to the famous First Island chain, through the U.S. territories, through the compact states, and then on to the treaty allies. The U.S. has freedom of movement, and in the case of U.S. territories and the freely associated states, strategic denial of any other military, which brings it right up to the Philippines, right up to Japan, and backing onto Taiwan. This construct underpins the way the U.S. looks at its defense architecture in the Pacific. This is how you have this kind of corridor of freedom that goes from Hawaii all the way across. It's been taken for granted. When you hear about the first island chain, second island chain, the assumption is you can get across the Pacific Islands. So this is a problem for China. What's China been doing? While we've been focused on the first and second island chain and taking the compacts and the territories for granted, Beijing has been using very effective political warfare to leapfrog. And we saw it in May and June of 2022, height of COVID, when 8 Pacific Island countries waived their COVID restrictions to allow Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China at the time, to come in with his very large delegation. Next slide, please. These are the exclusive economic zones of the countries that he visited. They went right over the first and second island chain and beyond the compacts. And at the meeting, we got a sense of what some of China's priorities for the region were. Next slide, please. China presented a vision, PRC Pacific Islands vision, to be supported by a 5-year action plan. That included things like police training, cyberspace, customs inspections, quarantine, training diplomats, pre-positioning of emergency supplies. It was augmented by various kind of bureaucratic things like Chinese government declaring a special envoy for Pacific Island country affairs, which they've done. China Pacific Island countries ministerial dialogue on law enforcement, which they've done. These are very active projects for embedding through political warfare across the Pacific Islands, leapfrogging that constraint that the U.S. strategic environment, defense environment sort of took for granted. And we can see the effects on the ground. Next slide, please. This is Prime Minister Sogavare of the Solomon Islands with his new Chinese friends. They switched from Taiwan to China in 2019 and of course signed a security agreement with China that, according to leaked drafts, with the permission of Prime Minister Sogavare, gives the Chinese the right to deploy PLA in the Solomon Islands in order to protect Chinese citizens and Chinese major projects. We're seeing other manifestations of this as well, of the success of China's political warfare operations as well. Next slide, please. With the US being blocked from ports in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, these are Coast Guard vessels that were on illegal fisheries patrols, and both Solomons and Vanuatu just didn't pick up the phone and give them permission in time for them to come in before they ran out of fuel, so they had to move on. The leaders across the region know what they're looking at and are very, very concerned. Next slide, please. President David Panuelo of the Federated States of Micronesia, he's no longer in office, but while he was in office, wrote 3 letters of concern. This is the second one. In it, he describes what China was proposing as the single most game-changing proposed agreement in the Pacific in any of our lifetimes, and he very explicitly linked this to Taiwan. To be clear, it's China's long-term goal to take Taiwan peacefully if possible through war if necessary. And as we saw from the strategic map, in order to be able to do that, the Pacific Islands need to be under control of China, or at least out of the game. The defense perimeter starts at Taiwan, doesn't end at Taiwan, and we don't think China's ambitions either end at Taiwan. And this is something that India is very, very aware of. They've seen very similar sorts of Chinese activities in the Indian Ocean Islands, especially Sri Lanka, but in the Maldives and Seychelles as well. The Indian strategic community knows what it's looking at when it sees these sorts of activities, and is very concerned about the overall stability of the Indo-Pacific and about their own security if the Pacific Islands become compromised. Next slide, please. Which is one of the reasons why you saw Prime Minister Modi going to Papua New Guinea in May of 2023 and meeting Prime Minister Marape, but also meeting Pacific Island leaders. India spent months setting up this meeting. They set up a secretariat in Port Moresby. They invited and paid for Pacific Island leaders to come to this meeting. They had planned for quite a large delegation of Indian business to come as well. I'll explain what happened to that afterwards. But the planning was somewhat derailed because Prime Minister Modi was due to be there for 2 to 3 days with quite a large delegation. But then unexpectedly, President Biden announced that he would be visiting at exactly the same time and meeting with the Pacific Island leaders that India had convened. That forced India to cut its meeting short with Prime Minister Modi, and quite a bit of the delegation didn't come. It was reduced. That was why this moment where Prime Minister Marape met Prime Minister Modi on the tarmac in Papua New Guinea and went to touch his feet in a sign of respect, and was then greeted with a big hug by Prime Minister Modi, was such an important moment. It was an acknowledgement that this was a very important visit for the Pacific Islands, but also in some ways a bit of an apology for the complications that were caused by the US change in plans. And the hug is kind of this sort of symbol of acceptance, of trying to work together. Next slide, please. At that meeting, India announced a 12-step action plan to strengthen India-Pacific Island country partnership. These are extremely well thought out series of initiatives that are designed to create bottom-up human security and to go in areas which neither traditional Western partners have addressed, like dialysis issues around dialysis treatment, but also where China tends to come in and start to engage on the political warfare front, like the SME stuff. We can go through them if anybody's interested, but this is a plan for combating ground level political warfare that is innovative and helpful, and built off of the experience of what they saw China do in the Indian Ocean, India and elsewhere. Next slide, please. So what we saw on May 22nd in Port Moresby was, sorry about that spelling, was in the morning, a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Pacific Island leaders. And in the afternoon, because President Biden had to cancel a meeting between Secretary Blinken and what was called by the US the Pacific Island Forum leaders. Now, because it's the Pacific Island Forum, that expands it out to other Pacific Island Forum members like Australia and New Zealand. And it very much shows the difference in approach that India and the US is using in the region. This difference of approach doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. And this is where some of the things that Dr. Lemay was talking about, needs to be refined. The US can do things India can't. India can do things the US can't. Working together, they're in a position to counter the political warfare attack and create true human security from the ground up to the larger strategic context that really would provide an alternative for the people of the Pacific Islands and also extricate some of this incredibly corrosive Chinese activity. So the US, for example, it can do things. One of the ways that China is getting in across the region is through gaming World Bank and ADB contracts that essentially subsidizes BRI initiatives across the region. The US is in a position to help with that. Meanwhile, India is in a position to help with things that can protect at a very ground level, like, for example, the innovations around forensics. So in Palau, they have a real problem with Chinese drugs coming in, bringing in a lot of money that's used to corrupt the political system, but they have no forensics lab that can do the assessment of the drugs that can bring that to prosecution. That's the sort of thing where the US and India can work together at a very ground level, but also at a strategic level to block and build, to block out the Chinese influence and build domestic sovereignty and security that puts it in a better position. I'd also add that if you combine it with the sorts of things that can be offered by Quad members like Japan and Australia, you start to be able to put together a really interesting way of creating a very different sort of strategic map than what we just saw in that last slide in the Pacific Islands. And with that, my time is up, and I hand back over to Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cleo, for making this a truly Indo-Pacific security discussion. Now, last but not least, we have Dr. Michael Rubin. Michael Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. A former Pentagon official, Dr. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq. He has also spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. For more than a decade, he taught classes at sea about the Horn of Africa and Middle East conflicts, culture, and terrorism, and was deployed at U.S. Navy and Marine units. Dr. Rubin and Akhil Ramesh are also co-authors of the most recent U.S.-India chapter of Pacific Forum's Comparative Connections e-journal. A link to their latest chapter is available in the chat box now. And with that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rob. I want to thank the Hindu American Foundation, the Pacific Forum. I also have to say that I'm thrilled to be here. I think both Seto and Cleo, let alone Akhil, have forgotten more about India than I'll ever know. So it's just such an honor to be able to be on a panel with both of you. Let me just look at this from afar, because again, my specialty is more West Asia than South Asia. But of course, it's impossible to do anything regarding Iran. And when I used to live in Iran, this was clear as day without factoring in India. And so sometimes the United States tends to look at the world as a series of bilateral relations in which we are alone in the sandbox with whatever country we're engaging, when in reality, the interplay is much more complicated. And certainly, as Setu has said, in the context of some of India's military developments and interoperability, this is especially true when it comes to India. There's an old Russian joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who says, things can never be so bad, can never be worse than now. I mean, war, famine, economy, and so forth couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, they can always get worse. So I'm going to start with my optimistic take And then I'm actually going to go into my genuine American optimistic take. Let's first acknowledge the obstacles. Continued obstacles loom in this blossoming of Indo-United States ties. There's too often a tendency within the State Department about the State Department linking India and Pakistan, where the Secretary of State or the Director of Central Intelligence will go to one and then feel that he needs to go to the other. And generally speaking, there had been some attempts prior to this previous administration to prevent that from happening, from at least going to someplace in between instead of flying directly from India to Pakistan or vice versa. We need to recognize that our relationship with India is about India, period. And Pakistan, through its own internal emphases, and if I could be so blunt, mistakes, is falling behind. And there's no reason why India should have to deal with the US-Pakistan relationship as a lodestone around the blossoming of US-India ties. I also worry in the future about anti-Modi sentiment among some progressives. And here, I just don't want to see a repeat of the mistakes the United States has made with regard to Saudi Arabia. Even among some within the Indian American community who may be critical of Prime Minister Modi, it's important not to get distracted by the trees when we're looking at the whole forest. The fact of the matter is, India is a democracy, there's rule of law, and whether or not some Americans and some Indian Americans prefer one politician or another, it's important to put that aside, compartmentalize that, and recognize that there's a value in the blossoming of a much more broad, solid relationship between two countries. This is about countries and national interests. It's not about individuals. I also worry about US blindness to some Indian security concerns. For example, the rise of Khalistani separatism, which, if again I can be so blunt, I think the evidence is pretty clear that this isn't an organic movement, that there is definite ISI component to its sponsorship. The only thing I could say here is that the burning or the attack on the San Francisco consulate may be a wake-up call within the US law enforcement community. So finally, the United States is starting to take this much more seriously. The last point I want to make before talking about the opportunities in US-India ties is that with India overtaking China in population, that's been the headlines recently based on UN estimates. But I think a lot of these estimates, when I went to the demographic data, buried the lead. It's not just that it's going to be a neck and neck race. Because of China's 36 years of a one-child policy, China is about to head over a precipice. So we're soon going to be at a point where India will have 1.8 billion people and China will only have 450 million people if we look towards the end of the century. So with that demographic chasm opening, India certainly would be right to seek to act more on the global stage commensurate with its economic and demographic power. The question is whether this will lead to tensions with the United States as legitimate Indian interests, legitimate American interests clash. Now, there's nothing wrong with a clash between allies. It happens all the time, for example, between the United States and France. It's just something we need to be prepared for. I mean, certainly there's going to be a tension when it comes to India's traditional demand with regard to multipolarity, with regard to UN reform, and so forth. That said, as an American, as opposed to my Russian joke, I truly am optimistic. I'm an Iran watcher by training. When I used to live in Iran, they used to call me Pasari Shaitani Bozorg, son of the great Satan. And I first became involved with India with regard to Afghanistan, especially with regard to the port of Chabahar. Well, the United States was concerned about many of the developments in Chabahar, basically because we didn't want our NATO allies supplying Afghanistan through it for fear that American money would flood into Iran. Now that Afghanistan, for better or actually for worse, has settled the way it is, India has continued to be interested in Chabahar, but more for a Central Asian corridor. And while the Americans might make a pro forma objection that we don't like this, the fact of the matter is Americans really don't care about Indian developments in Chabahar anymore. And so it's just one obstacle, one impediment, which no longer exists. I spent a lot of my time in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia and in Somaliland. And it's always frustrated me that the United States doesn't see the economic potential of Africa. You get on a flight in Djibouti or in Addis Ababa, and it's just filled with Chinese businessmen and so forth. If the United States isn't going to take the lead when it comes to when it comes to Africa, there's no reason why we can't act by proxy and in partnership with India, because certainly India is much wiser to the opportunities that exist, especially in East Africa. Cleo talked about the Pacific Ocean, and I fully agree with what she said, but there's also something to be said for growing Indian involvement along the entirety of the India Ocean basin, including the Horn of Africa, all the way south to Mozambique, which I had the opportunity to go to last year when I was looking at captured Islamic State paraphernalia in Cabo Delgado. A lot of it was being transferred from Karachi. If India had more of a security presence in the region, I'm not sure we would have gotten to where we were in Mozambique. When it comes to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, India has refrained from joining the trade pillar of the agreement, and it looks like the Indian government's still deliberating whether or not to join that part of the agreement. But the United States and India are attempting to resolve some of the regulatory hurdles pertaining to cooperation on critical and emerging technologies. And frankly, the growing attention to supply chain issues with regard to China provide an incentive in order to resolve some of these regulatory issues. Look, this is a bureaucratic matter. It's not going to be easy, but now both sides have much more of an incentive to do this, and both sides will gain significant strategic or economic reward should we do it. In the article Gil and I wrote, we talked about the introduction, for example, of Apple and Apple iPhone stores and so forth into India. The sheer market which India represents portends to the fact that we're going to have a much stronger economic relationship in the future. When it comes to arms procurement, and on one hand, look, interoperability matters. On the other hand, India is correct to say that even though they take for their own internal defense security weaponry from a number of different sources, between 2018 and 2022, 45% of India's arms imports came from Russia. At the same time, this is going to change because of Russian non-delivery on certain key contracts. And at the same time, we do need to give the Indians credit that they have not allowed for technology leakage. They do not provide American weaponry to the Chinese or to the Russians or vice versa. The fact of the matter is, even though we would like to see India as a better customer of American weaponry, just for the sake of having the training relationship, the decades-long maintenance relationship, and so forth, at the same time, we don't have the same concerns with regard to India that in the past we have, for example, with regard to Armenia, which also had taken Russian arms. So this is, on one hand, often highlighted as a problem. In reality, it's much more of an opportunity now. And this is one of the reasons why I very much do think that the future of India-US ties are bright. Ashley Tellis recently wrote an article which casts some doubt on this. But in this, like I'll say, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past, and I only get that right about 50% of the time. I would say when it came to Ashley Tellis's assessment of the future of US-India ties, he's in the 50% of his time that he's not getting it right, because just overwhelming all the data points show and all the political will shows that we're moving in the right direction. I think this is going to be evident later this month when we have the state visit. So with that, let me turn the floor back over to Rob.
Thank you very much, Michael. As a PhD candidate in history, I certainly resemble those remarks. Thank you. Now let's shift to the discussion and Q&A portion of today's program. As a reminder to our audience, there are two ways you may submit your questions or feedback to our speakers. The first is to write in your question using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your Zoom window. The second is to raise your virtual hand, also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Once you have been called on, Pacific Forum staff will enable your microphone. Please be ready to unmute yourself so that you can verbally ask your question, and be sure to state your name and affiliation for the group. I'd like to start with some questions of my own as we wait for other questions or comments to roll in. My first question will be for Satu, and that is, do you think the trajectory of the US-India relationship as it is now has been dependent at all on the party in power in Delhi? And if not, or if so, please explain. For Cleo, let me ask you, does India have a certain credibility in the Pacific Islands that the United States or possibly even China, due to their great power competition and the insinuations that come with it, may not have? And Michael, a similar question for you about Africa. What kind of credibility does India have in Africa that the United States might not? Okay, start with Satu when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Rob. Fair question. I think that we always look in international relations for turning points, pivots. But as both you and Michael said, you're, professional historians. I'm not, but I do try to look for patterns. And so there are both. There are turning points. And I would say certainly, everyone has their date for when things begin to turn in US-India relations, right? So Michael mentioned Ashley Tellis's article, and that dates it to the resolution, if you will, of the nuclear issue, or at least the treatment of the nuclear issue, and that created an opportunity for the upswing in relations. I actually think that the end of the Cold War created an environment for an upswing in US-India relations. And that was a very different government and party in power than today. There's no question that a series of structural changes in the international system have largely been beneficial to the US-India relationship. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States looking for partners as it shifts towards a focus on Asia, the resolution, or if you will, the setting aside of fundamental differences on the nuclear issue, India's economic reforms that brought more interest in India's search for a more defense and dynamic diplomatic posture. So I think the short answer is no one party in power, either in the US or in India, is responsible for the changes. But I believe that structural factors in the international system, combined with some key turning points and decisions that were made, are responsible. And you can pick which ones you think are the most important. But I would certainly say that the end of the Cold War, the pivot towards Asia and increasing negative US-China relationship, combined with some important moves by presidents and prime ministers on both sides, reaching out to each other and looking for ways to build a relationship, are all responsible.
Thank you. All right, Cleo.
Thanks. So if I may just quickly disaggregate, because we're using terms like the United States or India as if they're kind of monolithic. But if you're in the Pacific Islands, you see a lot of different United States showing up, and your relationship with those different branches of the US government, but also US people, US businesses, all very different. And overall, and also the Pacific Islands are very different. The freely associated states are completely different than Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is completely different than Tuvalu. So that's all needs to be made clear. But the US actually, across the Pacific Islands, has a very good reputation. There's a long, in the case of the freely associated states, they might have problems around things like the nuclear testing legacy, or the treatment of veterans, people from the FAS who've served in the US military and aren't getting treatment when they go back. But the relationship is very deep. They have US postal codes. They have relatives in Arkansas. They're very close and deep relationships. This isn't like another part of the world. And there's still a long memory of US liberation during World War II that, and not just the actual war itself, but somebody from Solomon Islands was talking recently about how he saw when they saw white and black American soldiers working together after the war, that was one of the inspirations for their desire for freedom movement from the British, which was something that it was something. So I wouldn't downplay how warmly the U.S. Can be viewed in the region, which is why they're asking for consular services at the new embassies. They're asking for the Peace Corps to come back. But what the U.S. delivers in the Pacific Islands, or is seen in the Pacific Islands as having to offer the Pacific Islands, is very different than what India has. So India is more like finding a kind of a long lost cousin. There's a lot of latent cultural comfort. They've watched Indian movies in a lot of places. They feel like an Indian family structure is very similar to their own family structure. India has similar economic challenges. Village scale economic issues are very similar to what you'd find in the Pacific Islands. And you can see by the suite of solutions that Prime Minister Modi offered when he came to the Pacific Islands, that special understanding. So one of the things that is on that 12-point list is this Jaipur foot clinic thing, which essentially provides low cost or free to the recipients prosthetic limbs. Now, that's the sort of thing that is transformational for a family in the Pacific Islands. If you have a family member in Solomon Islands who lost a limb to an unexploded ordnance, which Japan and the US has been saying they're going to clean up for a while, and India shows up and lets you walk again, and so be a contributing member to your family, that hits you at a whole different level, and resonates very deeply. So if India actually comes through on some of the things that it's talking about, it can resonate across the region in a way that the US hasn't in that specific zone, and in which China can't. But the overlap between what the US and India value, which is to be very reductionist about it, is faith, family, and freedom. So the importance of being able to worship as you like, the importance of the family as an economic structure and as an identity structure, and freedom from government, or from the sort of government or regime overreach you see with China, creates this zone where the overlap of trying to build environments for the people of the region where those three things are safe can really be something to build upon. So I wouldn't downplay how much the people of the region actually feel warmly towards the United States. We need to see how much India actually delivers on what it's promised, because of course, Prime Minister Modi came in 2014 and there was a really long lag. But the actual goals from the points of view of Pacific Islanders, we're not talking about Pacific Island Forum, we're not talking about that top level stuff, it's very similar and produces a bulwark against the kind of authoritarian expansionism that China is trying to push across the region that can provide the sort of human security that aggregates into actual regional security.
Thank you. All right, Michael.
I really like what Cleo said, the phrase you use, Cleo, cultural comfort, because I think that's one of the main advantages which India has with regard to Africa. Of course, there's a large Indian diaspora in Africa, and the days of Idi Amin, where this would be a negative, a pejorative, are long since gone. The fact of the matter is, it's something which is certainly a benefit to India in the region. Look, I mean, when I'm in East Africa, for example, I would see more Tatas than Fords. And people are familiar with the Indian brands. They're familiar with Bollywood movies. There is that cultural comfort. There's also the historical involvement. And if I can expand from Africa for a second, when I lived in Yemen, especially in southern Yemen, in the Hadramaut, in certain towns and coastal towns of the Hadramaut, you could see evidence a century later of the depth of the Indian trade and the Indian Ocean trade in those towns in Mukalla and Madab and Kalkaban and Tarim and so forth. There's a commitment. Simply put, there's no magic formula here. Being present matters. The United States has much greater opportunity than we take advantage of, simply because we're not present. But when we look at both the democratic boom, the fact that over the last 20 years, more than 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty, largely by free market reforms. In many cases, that's because of East Asia. In many other cases, that's because of Africa. And we need to recognize that. India has recognized that. There's also, if I can be more analytical, the fall of Francophone influence. And one of the reasons why Rwanda had its genocide is because the French were so upset that the Tutsis were trying to switch from French to English and started supporting the Hutus. And this is something which Emmanuel Macron has acknowledged in the last year and so forth, based on the French archives. When I look at Rwanda, for example, the Rwandans seek balance. They realize the dangers of being entrapped by China's debt diplomacy. Because India hasn't been as proactive there, the Rwandans turn towards Turkey to balance out China on construction and so forth. Likewise with Ethiopia. Ethiopia doesn't want to become a larger Djibouti, which is largely captured by China, and therefore they've turned to balance China with Germany. There's no reason why India can't compete there. There's also the fact of the matter, the managerial class throughout this region. It's one thing to create new investment. It's another thing to manage that. And one of the things we see across that Africa is the Indian managerial class, which only bolsters the reputation of India within the region. India is not seen as exploitive. It's seen as someone that contributes to the economies. It doesn't have that colonial legacy. The last thing I would say is it's not just Africa where we see this happening. I was in Armenia last month. I'm going to Armenia again this weekend. And one of the big stories that's underreported in the United States is, and underappreciated in the region, is the blossoming of Indian-Armenian ties on a number of different levels. And basically, the United States we only see what we want to see. We're very myopic. We don't recognize what's going on beneath the surface, but beneath the surface in the Caucasus, in Africa, elsewhere in the Middle East, I actually see a blooming of Indian opportunity and a recognition by India that the world is theirs.
Thank you. So we have 5 questions in our chat. And so for the next round, I will capture 3 of those. We'll come back to the remaining 2 in the next go round. First question comes from Stephen Cutler, and I will direct this one to Satu. I'd like to hear views on the potential role for the Philippines as a potential bridge partner for cooperation of India and the US in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean area. Okay. The next question I will direct to Cleo. Can India and the US cooperate with the Philippines on outreach to the forensic and counter narcotics area and in the humanitarian sector to these island nations with which China is developing a close relationship? This benefits the Philippines as well as India and the US, while possibly reducing the negative optics of the island nations aligning with India and the US. Thoughts? And in conclusion, I'll direct this one to Michael. With regards to India becoming the most populous country in the world and widening that gap from China year by year, would the US be correct to see India as a potential competitor similar to the current US-China relationship and start planning for how to manage that dynamic now? All right. Satu, I'll begin with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. There was a question about the Philippines in a couple contexts, Mr. Cutler's as well as David Carl's. Let me say this. I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was about 1.5 years or so ago that India sold some BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. One will recall that preceded the current administration in the Philippines which was at that time looking for a multiplicity of partners on the defense side, including Russia, I might add. Obviously, seen as very close to China, disconcertingly so by many Filipinos and others, that was not sufficiently recognizing the dangers China posed to the South China Sea. So that was a particular era, and the BrahMos sale was clearly important. If I may be mistaken on the empirical data here, but if I'm not mistaken, that is the first complete Indian weapon that has been sold in Southeast Asia. There have been other kinds of defense equipment, defense exchanges, certainly of various kinds. I thought that was the only sale of an export item. But in any case, the the India-Philippines relationship still seems to be quite nascent in my conversations in Manila over the last 2-3 years. And I've been there several times, including as a participant of a CNAS study group on the U.S.-Philippine alliance, and did not hear much about going forward with India, except for those BrahMos sales. And I would also just close by saying that the U.S.-Filipino relationship is substantively different from 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago, since President Marcos's recent visit to Washington. So there have been huge advancements in the U.S.-Philippines alliance over the last several months. And so I'm not sure that there is, a real energy to the India-Philippines relationship. I would much rather point to David Carl's question, which is that the new US, Philippines, Japan, Australia element is, I think, something very worthwhile watching. I am not anywhere near to believing this will replace or substitute for the US, India, Australia, Japan quad. But clearly, when you have 4 allies working that close together and working to create similar institutional, legal, and other frameworks for cooperation, it bears noting and monitoring, because that suggests a very close alignment of the alliances. So let me stop there and turn it over to others.
Thank you. All right, Cleo.
So I really like the bringing up the Philippines. This is kind of my when I really want to annoy a New Zealander, and who doesn't want to annoy a New Zealander on a regular basis. I tend to point out that the Philippines is way more of a Pacific Island country than New Zealand is. It's right there. There are a lot of Philippine citizens all over, especially the northern Pacific Islands. There's a lot of back and forth. There's direct flights, all that sort of stuff, but it's regional. And so we tend to be looking at the Pacific Islands from this kind of Five Eyes lens, which is bottom up. You're looking up from Australia and New Zealand, where in fact, as the map showed, the actual US footprint is more in the north. And if you're in the north, then the Philippines is incredibly important, and it's a treaty ally, and it's in the first island chain, and it has populations all over the region. So working with the Philippines, and of course it has similar economies and needs and concerns. So yeah, I feel great. And it's something that you hear from people in the region. In Palau, for example, there's some pretty highly placed person there who's talking about wanting to work more with the Philippines and with Vietnam, especially on maritime security issues. I'd just like to very quickly jump over to this issue of India being able to compete. Now, if it was a level playing field, India would not only compete, it would dominate. But China is gaming the global systems in multiple ways, including through corruption, bribing officials in the Pacific Islands, but also in Africa, and through gaming the World Bank, and in the case of Asia, the ADB. And this is where this kind of blocking and building approach that US and India can do in tandem would be very helpful. If some of that corruption was blocked through investigations into dirty money flows, and there was more corruption activity, for example, I'll give a very, very concrete example in the Marshall Islands. 2 Chinese took Marshallese citizenship and tried to set up a country within a country on Rongelap Atoll. They came within 1 vote in the Nidijela in their parliament of getting it passed. They bribed all sorts of people. They through They ended up in New York on trial. They pled guilty, which meant that we don't actually have the information on the Marshallese who were involved in that corruption. So those corrupt Marshallese, who we know took Chinese money because the Chinese pled guilty, are going to be running in the next election. And the US did not make that information public, hasn't shared it with the Attorney General of the Marshall Islands so they can go after their own corrupt people. And one of the two just got deported back to the Marshall Islands, where she can continue her bribery scheme if she wants to. And in that context, you've got Chinese companies winning contracts in the case of the Marshall Islands for a major energy project in the Marshall Islands. So if you don't block that those corrupt levers, and including through the way China is now using the World Bank and the ADB, India can't compete. So, and that's something that the US is uniquely placed to do. So you block and build, you block the corruption, you block the distortion of the international systems, and then you're creating the space to build something much more viable and stable over the long term.
Okay. Michael?
Let me just answer this question shortly. No, I don't think that the growing demographic presence of India is going to lead inevitably to any sort of conflict. The biggest problem with regard to China is, of course, it's an irredentist power. The 9-dash line is fictional. It's made fully of whole cloth. The historical maps show that. India has a degree, it has its own national interests. It has a degree of transparency. It's not trying to overturn the post-World War II liberal order. It's trying to play the game by the rules that exist. Therefore, I see much more opportunity for cooperation between two democracies than I see for an inevitable path to conflict. And by the way, this is one of the reasons, demography or not, why I think that India is one of those examples within the United States that has full-throated support by both Democrats and by Republicans. It hasn't become a political football because all sides of the American political spectrum recognize what an asset partnership and competition is. And lastly, I would just say part and parcel of this is, one of the reasons why I'm a capitalist, one of the reasons why I believe in small government and the free market is because I don't believe that when it comes to distribution of wealth, that we need to necessarily divide up the pie as if the pie never expands. Rather, through carefully crafted embrace of free markets and so forth, we can expand that pie and expand the benefits of the wealth that accrues. And when it comes to India-American trade, India-America cooperation, what I don't see is a dispute over a limited and finite wealth. I see a real opportunity for both sides to engage in a symbiotic relationship in order to expand the wealth for both the United States and India, as well as for our various partners.
All right, very good. Thank you. Okay, Setu, I believe you addressed Mr. Carl's question about the newly launched Quad with the Philippines. Kind of building on that, we also have a question from Grant Newsham about the prospects for the U.S. piggybacking on Japan's different and somewhat better relationship with India. Might India cooperate with Japan on certain military activities that they might not with the U.S. alone? And to Cleo and to Michael both, if it's not Japan per se, do you see other countries as potential bridge builders for the U.S.-India relationship? Starting with Setu.
Sure, those are great questions as well. And I simply start by saying, let me gently question the initial assumption that the U.S.-India relationship needs a bridge. I don't believe it does. I think it would be well, it wouldn't necessarily be useful to look for a bridge, but I understand the thematics. Now I'll tell Grant, and good greetings to you, Grant, that watching these things for a long time, I was posted in Japan from 92 to 96. So just want to remember writing a piece about India-Japan relations, if you can imagine, in the Nikkei Weekly in 1992, when people said, what are you talking about? These countries have never visited each other in the post-war era. and I think I'm right in saying that. I do not believe there was a prime ministerial visit between India and Japan between 1947 and 1992. Maybe there was one, maybe there was two or something. But literally no relations. And after India's nuclear test in 1998, there was no country that was more actively negative about that decision than Japan, much more so than the United States. So what I want to suggest is that it has not always been the case that the India-Japan relationship is forward-leaning and moving forward. It has either been non-existent or highly problematic, and Japan actually followed the US as the US began to improve relations at the end of the Cold War with with India. So my point is that Japan has somewhat followed it. Now, are there areas where Japan is moving forward? I don't know the details to which you specifically refer, but Japan and India have had a very difficult time arranging armaments, including that reconnaissance airplane that they were trying to negotiate. My conversations with Indian colleagues suggest that while Japan is certainly a sought-after partner in a variety of ways, whether military exercises, defense talks, strategic consultations, et cetera, people still understand Japan's constraints given its constitution, which remain quite considerable for Japan's role. Now, the new announcements at the December 2022 for Japan's national security, its counter-strike capability, its movement towards defense spending, et cetera, could create a new picture. But we're still some way away from what that means in terms of defense exports, defense collaboration, defense alignment, defense cooperation. So I, for one, on my side, see lots of space for cooperation between India and Japan. Much has already occurred, but there are much lower ceilings in Japan's ability to cooperate with India than American ceilings for cooperating with India, which seem to be much higher, but not necessarily easily achievable.
Right. Cleo?
So the India-Japan relationship is one that is not in our history books, but a lot of Indians will know about Subhash Chandra Bose's relationship with Japan during the war, and a lot of Japanese will know about Justice Pal's time on the War Crimes Tribunal after the war in Japan. And these are, they're not the sort of things that the West likes to talk about. They've got some baggage to them, to be polite. But from an Indian and a Japanese perspective, these resonate, and they are they see each other as having been there for parts of their societies. And in the Indian context, I mean, Imperial Japan, not the best ally in the world, but the people that were allying themselves with it saw themselves as going up against the British. And in terms of the war crimes, I mean, the Japanese war crimes were horrific. India took a different stance on it. So whether we think that these are whoever we are, we need to accept that these resonate within India and within Japan, and create a linkage, especially at an, like say, inconvenient time in both of their histories. And that's why there's actually been a lot of trust that has developed between very deep and core layers of their strategic community. And that's why Japan is allowed to operate in sensitive areas of India's Northeast, for example, where nobody else is. So that India-Japan relationship is in a very kind of Indo-Pacific Asian way, not visible so much on paper, but it is truly there at a very deep and fundamental level. And I think a lot of discussions that happen are quiet, off the record, but are important. And there are zones, areas where the US working together with India and Japan, like, for example, in the freely associated states, where Japan also has a very long history. Palau Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia were part of the South Sea Mandate after World War I. And for 25, 30 years, Japan administered them as colonies. So there are a lot of Japanese family names because there was intermarriage. There are older people in the region speak Japanese. That it is, again, a part of history that isn't often discussed, but is important and has strategic implications. And it's a zone where India can be naval cooperation, especially if you include Taiwan in the countries that recognize Taiwan, starts to become very interesting and effective. So I personally think it's an interesting idea worth exploring much more, and it has deeper roots than it might seem.
Very well. Michael?
If I may, I'll be brief. One issue with regard to the Quad that worries me, and this is a little tangential to the question, but again, I'll be brief, is that the United States, one of the weaknesses of the United States in the Quad vis-a-vis the other members, which neither India nor Japan, that put us apart from India and Japan, is that the United States doesn't fully appreciate the Indian security concerns. The fact of the matter is China still occupies a Maryland-sized chunk of Kashmir called Aksai Chin. And even if the United States wants to be even-handed in this and just labeled as disputed territory, if we expect the Quad to develop, if we expect India to generally have our back on our concerns, then we need to start deferring to India with regard to its security concerns, rather than try to be morally equivalent when it comes to some of these disputes. Where Japan differs from the United States on this, of course, is that Japan also feels a much more immediate threat from China, especially with the Senkaku Islands, and therefore perhaps it would be useful if the Indians and the Japanese, if the Japanese especially, pulled aside some of the American diplomats and basically told us not to go wobbly on certain issues. The American concept of history is too often, at best, 10 years long. At worst, it begins with a blank slate every time we have a new administration, and the other states in the Quad don't have that sort of luxury. If I could address the question more literally about what bridges might exist, well, let's not just look at what does or does not exist now, and I tend to agree with Setu that, I mean, India and the United States don't have a bridge. But when I look at an opportunity, India is going to be crucial when it comes to post-regime change Iran. And I'm not talking here as a rabid neocon or something like that, but when you have the supreme leader of Iran, he's survived 2 bouts of cancer, he's partially paralyzed, he's in his 80s, say what you will about octogenarian ayatollahs, but their lifespan is limited. And it's not clear. Khomeini doesn't have the religious credentials which Khomeini did prior to 1989. Therefore, it's not clear that there's going to be a clear consolidation of power. One thing that many people in the United States don't fully appreciate is the linkages between Iran and India and Iran and Japan. The reason why Encyclopedia Britannica was for so many years banned in Islamic Republic of Iran is because they made a point of actually of noting that Khomeini's grandfather came from India. Likewise, many of the Iranians who can't get visas to study in the United States or Europe end up at JNU or other Indian universities. And culturally, of course, the language of literature, the lingua franca of India, the official language of the Mughal Empire was Persian. And so you have those cultural links as well. Again, what many people in the United States, because our concept of history is short, don't understand as well, is the depth of the Iranian-Japanese relationship. The Iranians, in the especially around 1904, 1905, and for the decade after, were absolutely obsessed with Japan because of the Russo-Japanese War. You had state visits between Foreign Minister Amina Sultan in 1905 to Japan as Iran wanted to replicate the Japanese model. And this love of Japan still continues. You also have just the reality that much of the Japanese labor force, or the labor force in Japan for the construction industry, is Persian, is Iranian, and therefore you have a lot of Iranians, a surprising number, who also speak Japanese. If I can make a non-politically correct analogy, I mean, the Iranians are to Japan what perhaps some Salvadorans are to the American construction industry, at least in Virginia, Maryland, DC area where I live, as the labor, given the demographic realities of the place. And so you do have an opportunity in the future if we don't want to just look at the now.
Very good. All right. In conclusion, I will ask one final question of all three panelists, and this time I will go in reverse order. So basically, what do you see as the next proper step for US-India relations? What should they be coordinating on next? Let's start with Michael.
I mean, basically, I think the Biden administration is doing the right thing. I believe that Jake Sullivan is over in India now preparing for the state visit, but it's all about supply chains, and it's all about deregulating some of the economy, ending some of the protectionism. This is more something which India needs to focus on than the United States. The United States has opportunities as Russia doesn't fulfill its commitments to India. The United States should see that, fill that vacuum if we can actually put on a strategic lens that transcends a single administration rather than simply navel gaze as we enter our own election season.
Very good. Cleo?
I wouldn't presume to tell the US government what to do, right? Obviously. But I think that the next step should be perhaps the same step as what should have happened previously, which is for sections of the State Department that have been making decisions that have been a little bit inexplicable, and if you want to build a better relationship with India, to maybe get out of the way. The Indian media is now much less likely to take these sorts of things lying down. But it's just the US has the right and the duty to try to ensure that that in this battle of systems, democracy, transparency, accountability, human rights, rule of law are front and center. It needs to do that across the board if it's going to do that at all. Otherwise, it looks like it's playing kind of favorites. So if State Department is calling out India on stuff that it doesn't call out China on, then that reflects badly on the United States of America and its commitment to those values and to the system that we are all in the free world fighting to protect. So I think that the US State Department can take a step back and figure out what are the important battles it wants to fight at a global scale if it wants to protect those values that are so intrinsic to what the US is and what the free world needs right now. And so in the context of dealing with India, and we've heard a lot about the unique challenges that India has, if it's looking at India through one lens, but looking at China through a different lens, then there's a problem. And if it wants to work on dealing with this, I would argue, nearly existential for a lot of countries, at least in the Pacific, but elsewhere as well, challenge that's coming out of Beijing. We need to really refocus on what China and the Chinese Communist Party is and what it's trying to accomplish, and make sure that that's front and center for the battle that's coming out of the State Department for those sorts of democracy, freedom, accountability, rule of law, those sorts of issues. And that transcends not just diplomatic engagement, but economic engagement as well. So I would just say, before you start looking at India for some of the things that the State Department has in the past, make sure that you're going after the biggest, most egregious transgressor of some of those things on the planet, and who's exporting that system elsewhere, and that would be China.
All right. And Setsu, you get the last word.
Well, certainly not the last word. What a fascinating discussion. And if I can start out by saying something that was so evident from Michael's and Cleo's remarks, which is, here we are discussing the US-India relationship in the context from Iran to the Pacific Islands, which should tell you the transformation that's occurred in the relationship, that we can simply have that conversation, meaning that we can think about the role of India in the Pacific Islands, or in vis-a-vis Iran, or post-current Iranian government, et cetera. So I found that quite fascinating, and very grateful to my fellow panelists for making me think about the range of that. Look, I don't have a big ticket for the US-India relationship. I want to remain true and consistent to my analytic assessment at the beginning, and it has not fundamentally changed for a very long time. I'm sad to say, sometimes I'm sad to say, which is that this relationship needs to be calibrated incrementally and rationally and realistically. And my fear and concern is that sometimes the relationship on both sides overreaches, and then there's a sense of despondency or despair. I don't have that despondency and despair, because I think fundamentally the trajectory of the relationship is steadily upward, steadily more cooperative in more areas, in more parts of the world, on more issues. But the idea that it's a single problem, or a single country, or a single issue, or a single outcome seems unrealistic to me in the world that's being created. So what I'd like to see the US and India do is to right-size their realistic expectations of each other, that we should open up the technology spigot and defense spigot without any returns on Indian commitments, and that the US should unrealistically expect that India is somehow going to come in a confrontation with China in the current environment. I would say that's a far stretch even for our closest allies, where there's continual debates in Canberra, Tokyo, Seoul, and elsewhere, including in Europe, about just what is the calibration as good allies of the United States in managing the relations with China. And I don't think we should have some unrealistic expectation. The one concrete policy area where I'd like to see much more done between the US and India is the kind of long, boring work of the new lines, as Michael mentioned, of supply chains, of manufacturing, of opportunities to upskill workers and technological skills that are needed for both countries to adapt to an era when there are rapidly new changing technologies. And I think there are some very creative partnerships to be had, whether via a combination of labor mobility or shared training or shared skill harnessing that can be done. Those aren't sexy, if you will. They aren't particularly dramatic. They don't bring to visions of clashes across continents and strategy. But I think they're going to be fundamental to winning, if you will, the 21st century competition over the ability to create good, sustainable, and enduring societies. And I think that's where the United States and India have a really great thing to show the world, that these are societies that go through enormous change, enormous transition, and can work together under a legal democratic system to advance their societies, their interests, and their interactions with the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists, all of our speakers for these great presentations and taking time to share their insights with us. I want to thank all those who submitted questions and contributed to this discussion as well. The next webinar in this series, A New Era of U.S.-India Relations Part 2, Competing Together, will be happening next week on Wednesday, June 14th at 9 a.m. in Honolulu. The featured speakers will be Elbridge Colby from the Marathon Initiative, Belina Chichakarov from FACE for a Conscious Experience, and Pacific Forum's own Akhil Ramesh. Hindu-American Foundation should be there supplying opening remarks as well. Additional information about the event will be sent over email shortly, and the registration link for the webinar is also available in the chat box now. We would appreciate if you could take a few minutes following the event to fill out a post-event survey. Please see the link shared in the chat box now. And finally, I want to thank our sponsors at Hindu American Foundation for their support of this webinar series. And thanks again to all of our wonderful speakers today. Thank you all once again, and we will see you in the near future. Stay well.
Bye-bye,
and
everyone.
stay
Thank
safe.
you. And Michael, wonderful pet you have there joining the discussions.
That's neo-conservative, my little armchair warrior.
Wonderful. Great to see you, Cleo. Rob, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks.
Rob.
Good seeing you guys.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.